I just wanted to start with what is gender?
Woman and man.
What is gender?
The easiest answer would be men and women.
Okay.
More than that.
Okay. How is it more than that?
It relates to how men and women interact
Very good.
in the family, with the environment, with society, and
Okay.
also maybe we're considering other individuals like transgender. I don't know how that puts into that.
Okay, so you know, you could easily teach a whole course on this subject, but you've captured the essence of gender. So we know sort of what sex is, although it's more complicated than we thought. We now know, but gender specifically was coined as a term to look at the relationships between people of different genders, and that means, as you said, in their broader context. So we can't just talk about women and men. We need to talk about people in their particular environment, context, age, relationships, and power is always a part of that. So gender also is focusing our attention on relationships and how those are relations of power between people in different situations. And those things are socially and historically defined. We don't know what those relationships are until we study them in a particular place. So there tends to be a lot of talking about sort of essential differences between men and women, and that's really been critiqued by people who've done research to find how variable gender relations can be. So keep in mind that it's that much more complicated concept that has to do with people in their relationships in a particular context at a particular moment. So it's important to think about them as things that vary and change, not as fixed things, not these essential things, even though a lot of gender research focuses on women. But gender as a concept is much more complicated than that. So why is it important for a course on the Amazon to think about gender? So in relation to resources, different perspectives than men, different kind of relationship with the community. And so we tend to think about gender in terms of a couple of different ways. One has to do with rights and equal rights. So if women's contributions to natural resource management are not recognized, they may not have access to credit programs, training programs, markets, because there may be an assumption that they're really kind of like housewives whose main or only role is to take care of the family. So there are these kind of stereotypes about gender roles that often get in the way of seeing what's actually happening and can get in the way of women exercising their visibility and their rights. Okay, so gender relations, because they're relations of power and because women may not be very visible and recognized for their roles, they may not have access to power. Intersectionality usually refers to how multiple social definitions intersect. So women, that's why you can't just talk about women. You can talk about ethnic women of a particular tribe, of a particular age, in a particular situation. So all of those things will intersect to define what those roles look like. Yeah? So that's what intersectionality is about. For example, race is a very important variable that intersects with gender. The situation for a white woman is not the same as a situation for a black woman, and on, depending on their circumstances. So that's a very good point. In relation to the Amazon, as you started out, Pamela, talking to us about natural resources. So if that's really our focus is sustainability and sustainable development in the Amazon, then it's important to understand how all the different actors are interacting with natural resources. Tends to be more visibility for commercial enterprises, things that go to market, rather than subsistence activities where women tend to be more active. So they may be more provisioning the family, and that's a really important economic role they play, but it may not be that visible. And so there are a lot of assumptions and stereotypes that pervade people's way of thinking and kind of blind you to what you actually see. We have these big gender glasses so that you can see the invisible people. And then I used to have a big ear for hearing the invisible voices. Actually, I didn't have it. Someone else did. I'm sure Susan remembers these glasses. So part of it is just seeing actually what's happening, getting beyond our assumptions and stereotypes. And the other is recognizing that there are important differences among people in their access to resources, in their power to make decisions, in their autonomy, and in their impact on sustainable development. So it's a social focus that takes us to really understanding how different people might be, even within the same family. So Seth pointed out, gave us a link to an NPR story that really kind of flipped our understanding of evolution, human evolution, where we tend to focus on men as hunters in those hunting and gathering societies, but the research has shown pretty clearly that most of the provisioning actually came from the women who were gathering all the time. And those hunts were not all that successful all the time, very prestigious, that was part of the prestige system, but, and also very important in providing protein, etc. But a lot of the food actually came from women, and probably women were involved in developing agriculture for that reason. So those are things we don't really think about because we have our own kind of blinders on. So that was great to share that. And also Pamela pointed out in her post talking about the gender blind work that she has done with communities. Without thinking about it, they implemented a lot of little changes that probably made a big difference for the women involved. Thinking about the timing of meetings, thinking about having childcare during the meetings, and other ways to facilitate women attending a meeting, as opposed to saying, well, we had a meeting, but none of the women came. And so, trying to make that easier for them. And also paying more attention to what they said, or making sure that they were listened to as well as other people. So gender is a focus I've had since my whole career, since I was in graduate school. I was in graduate school during the kind of second wave women's movement here in the 1970s. That was when I met Susan. We were both graduate students together. So we've had a long history of this. And I want to talk first about the programs that we have developed here at UF to try to focus on gender and how they've evolved over the years. So first I wanted to just make this point. So what's the difference between equality and equity? So you can see here, everybody has the same box to stand on, but only this person can really see easily over that fence. Whereas here, they have what they need to be at an equal playing field. So we tend to think about it in terms of equity because it recognizes that everybody is different, everybody's situation is different, and it's not necessarily identical things we want, it's that fairness. So I'm not going to try to go through this chart, but I just wanted to put it up here to show you that thinking ideas about women in development and gender in development, this was published 1989, Caroline Moser, have changed over the decades. And so there was kind of a beginning period when women were seen as welfare mothers. So they were kind of needy people who needed to have particular attention because they took care of children. And this was, again, a kind of a stereotype from a Western point of view of families, where you have the male breadwinner and the female housewife, which was, when I was growing up, that's what we had, supposedly. But over time, equity became the focus. So not just having women as getting extra attention because they're needy, but they have a right to be equal participants. And equity became important. They also later became a focus of poverty intervention. So female-headed households tended to be poorer. For example, they became target groups. Again, kind of taking away their agency and thinking of them as needy victims in development. And then this argument of efficiency, which has more to do with understanding the things that women do that are important to recognize if you're trying to support sustainable development. So even if you don't believe in gender rights, if you don't know that women are doing important things with forest products, your project won't work as well as it should. So it's a different kind of argument. It's one that we developed a whole lot because it doesn't depend on, we think about gender as they're the arguments that come from the heart. You know, women should have equal rights and autonomy, or at least equitable. But there's the part from the head, which is when we analyze what women are doing, we need to take that into account in designing projects and policies and make sure that they're also contemplated so that the project or the policy will actually work the way it's supposed to. So that's the efficiency argument. The project's going to be more efficient, the action's going to be more efficient if we actually understand who's doing what and how those are related. And then empowerment, which here in 1989 was called the most recent approach. All of these still coexist in different gender approaches that you'll see. But they're different ways of thinking about it. I'm going to post this if you want to study it later online. So a lot of this began in the 70s with, as I said, the women's movement here in this country. We were able to, all the women in the country were able to pressure the U.S. government and the USAID, which administered our development aid, to begin to pay attention to, require that projects pay attention to gender. And so this was the first statement in the Percy Amendment 1973 that talked about integrating women, improving their status, and assisting the total development effort. So that's both rights and efficiency, both sides. And then in 1981, a very powerful statement was crafted by the new Women in Development Office that laid out the rationale for this and talked about the pace of development and the quality of its outcome being dependent on the degree to which women were incorporated. So very much pushing the efficiency argument here. Here at UF, a group of us in that period, in the early 80s, started to work on on various activities related to gender and development. So Susan Coates, Sandra Russo, and I were all graduate students when we started talking about these things. And Anita Spring, who's now retired, was a young faculty member. So there were a few other people with us. And we started out working through Latin American studies, African studies, and international programs in agriculture, which is where a lot of the development work was going on. We created an official program called Women in Agriculture in 1984, and the name evolved over time. It became Women in Agricultural Development in 1986, and then it became Gender, Environment, Agricultural, and Participation in in 1993. So you see, we were keeping up with the way people were thinking about gender. We had a seminar series and a newsletter, and we had a bunch of conferences. I'll talk about some of them. We developed a Women in Development certificate, later Gender and Development. This still exists. It's administered by the Center for Gender Research and Studies. We did a lot of gender analysis training on campus. We had an annual Martin Luther King Day training that went on for many years. It was students teaching other students. And we created a large data set in our library, which is here. So a lot of us donated our materials to the library. They're all in the library right now, if you want to read more. In this period from 78 to 88, we developed a really focused effort because of a big project that UF had called the Farming Systems Support Project. This was a USAID grant for us to support the farming systems projects all over the world. And Susan Coates, who had finished her degree by this time, was hired to come back and be the associate director. So we had our own little laboratory there for trying to see how we could integrate gender into a big program. And it was a good target for us because farming systems was an approach that looked at farms as farm families, as a unit, and tried to look at the diversity of types of farm families and design interventions that would suit the needs of those different types. And within that, we wanted to insert gender analysis as part of that understanding of the diversity of farm families. And the FSSP was providing technical assistance, networking, and training materials. So this is where we were able to really try to focus some effort on developing materials and tools that could help people incorporate gender. I'm sure that Susan will add things after we go. So the reason for this approach called farming systems, and we had a person here, Pete Hildebrand, who was one of the pioneers around the world in this approach. That's why we got the big grant. A lot of the Green Revolution and other kinds of technological efforts had mostly favored richer farmers, people with more resources. They had not really addressed the needs of many of the small farmers around the world, limited resource farmers. And the other idea was to get away from the separation of research and extension, where you had researchers doing experiments on their plots in an experiment station, and then handing over those results to someone else to go and give to farmers. The idea here was to start with the farmers, with their own diagnosis of their problems, and work with them to develop solutions right there on their own farms. So it's a very revolutionary idea at the time. And also, as I said, looking at complex family farm systems, that required an interdisciplinary approach. You couldn't just be an agronomist. You needed other people there who would look at social relations and other aspects. So it was a different approach to agricultural development. Pete Hildebrand, who I just married, I just mentioned him. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago. He was a great mentor for me. He helped me work. Not kidding, we never were married. But he developed a whole approach to analyzing small farms called ethnographic linear program, and he has his own set of materials in the library on this. So with the farming systems research and extension approach, we worked on developing a recognition of the importance of women in these families, both in productive activities and in their role as housewives and family reproduction, and looking at the dynamics within the family. And building on this idea that farmers were diverse and they needed to be understood as different domains for extension. So different groups might need different things in a different way. We had an initial conference. This is the book that came from it in 1986, called Gender Issues in Farming Systems Research and Extension. We thought this would be a really focused topic with about 20 people. We got 200. People were really hungry for this. They wanted to understand, agricultural scientists, social scientists who were farmers really wanted to understand how to do this. And Carmen de Anadir, who's the former director of the Center for Latin American Studies, was our keynote speaker. And these were our key themes. I don't have a copy of the book anymore. Somebody took off with it. But we did produce a book. And then we went on to build on that with a partnership with the Population Council to work more on methods. And so we produced these books, a methodology handbook for gender analysis in agriculture, and also this 2-volume set with case studies for doing gender analysis in agriculture. So basically, we were trying to develop tools and methods so that people could use these in their own work. There would be examples and case studies and training materials, and this would all go out through the Farming System Support Project Training Network. And this was also a time when social science involvement in agricultural research was expanding. So we were trying to have a big impact there. That was in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we started working, by this time we had the TCD program was functioning, and we decided we wanted to work more with conservationists. So until then, we've been focusing on agronomists and agricultural scientists. These were people who had already been working with people. Their agriculture involves people by definition. Conservation was a really different field because a lot of conservationists actually saw people as the enemy. So they're looking for protected areas that keep people out. And so we had to really rethink.
Sorry, could you clarify the difference between this conservationists? Because in Brazil we have like preservation and conservation.
Yeah, I was making a generalization there. So there is a whole range of viewpoints on this. But agriculturalists, by definition, are working with people. Conservationists, foresters, biologists, some of them really didn't think about people at all and only studied areas that had no human impact. So they were just not even in the picture. Other people were very much trying to work with people. And so there was a whole range. I didn't mean to stereotype the field of
no, okay. Because in English, what's the, in case I use from Brazil this perspective to conservationists that they want to be people engaged in the nature. So here we have like the word in this context, what's the specific word?
So we would talk about protectionism. That would be the people who want to keep people out of protected areas, keep them pristine, as opposed to conservationists who are talking about how to use resources in some sustainable manner. But there's a big range there. But those are the two words that in English we use to differentiate those points of view. Would you agree?
Thank you. Yeah.
So we began a new project in the 1990s, which you read about, called MERGE, Managing Ecosystems and Resources with Gender Emphasis. I have a whole bunch of copies of this if anyone wants a hard copy, and some are in Spanish. We have it on the website in Spanish, Portuguese, English, but I'm trying to clear out my office, so if you want any of these, please take them. The MERGE program was a partnership among universities in the North and the South and environmental NGOs in the US and Latin America. And it was really interesting. It responded to a call for proposals from the MacArthur Foundation, specifically on gender and natural resources. And we got together and planned a project in which each of us had our own separate proposal with our own objectives and our own budget, but they were connected. And fortunately, the MacArthur Foundation funded the whole set. And it was the best setup we have ever had for a project because everyone had their own resources and we shared them. Instead of somebody having to beg somebody else, we were able to share. And Susan was a part of this from her work in Ecuador. And she will talk more about that. But we had a strategy that involved connecting research, training, and application in the field across multiple sites. And about every 6 months, we would bring people together to share what they'd been learning and to learn new techniques. And so it became a learning network. And part of that was developing this conceptual framework that you looked at. This is something Susan put together at our conceptualization workshop where she compared gender with farming systems and gender with resource management. So everything was different. Here we sort of thought we had already figured it out and we just need to apply it to a different topic, but it was very different. For example, people concerned about conservation were looking at big landscapes. They weren't really seeing those family farms. That was not really, so then we had to talk about communities. We had to have a bigger frame of reference. And there were other differences. It required a lot of adaptation on our part to make this relevant to the people working in this new area. They were different interests, concerns, and ways of conceptualizing. At this, we decided to develop a conceptual framework, and this is what we started with. We had 5 hypotheses. The first one was low-income women bear the brunt of environmental degradation. So that was women as victims. We quickly discarded that and moved on. But we started with something very simple. What we ended up with was that conceptual framework that was a series of questions and ways to answer them. So and that was done over a period of 5 or 6 years. In all our different meetings, we would come back to the conceptual framework as it evolved, try it out, get more input, change it. It was a really dynamic process of generating a conceptual framework. And here is what you have seen. These are just the questions, but so it's sort of laid out now as a kind of cross-scale analysis with different tools that could be applied to answer each one of these different questions. And it became something people used. We've had a number of different people have picked this up and used it as a kind of framework for their research. But we were also involved, and we were very dedicated to this idea of mutual learning. So we didn't want this to be a training program where people came and delivered information to somebody else about gender. We wanted it to be a mutual learning where people on the ground who knew a lot about their communities would interact with people like us who had learned about gender in a lot of different places and might have ideas about methods and concepts that could help them understand what they were analyzing in their own local context. So we always involved local people as part of the training team. We took those same trainers to other sites, with other people, and really fostered this exchange. We talked about, I'm pretty sure Susan came up with this idea of the gender doorknob. It was a way you open a door to seeing a lot of the complexity that's otherwise invisible. Once you get down to the level of gender analysis, you see race, age, occupational diversity, all those things become more visible. So that's the intersectionality. Gender gives you access to all these. And as I said, we tried to link these different strategies in a forcing way. We have a book which we never managed to publish, but it's on the website. And one of the chapters is on institutionalization of gender in different organizations, how they actually incorporated some of this writing into their own practices and policies. And Susan's going to talk more about that also. So there's chapters on the conceptual framework, this idea of training, mutual learning as a training approach, and institutionalization are the things, the chapters in that book. It's on the website. And here we have John Bain, some other students. We also realized that there were no materials to use for training. There were no cases. The ones we found, there was one from Nepal, women collecting firewood. People in the Amazon couldn't relate to that. So we decided to develop case studies from the region with people in the region. And we ended up with 5, the conceptual framework and 4 others that focused on particular projects or organizations. Those are all on the web. So that was in the 90s, and then we all kind of migrated. Many of us migrated to other things, but the work on gender has continued here, not in the same way of a structured program, but we do have a number of new faculty researchers, and there is a gender and development working group. They're meeting today, actually, and their new courses. So this is continuing here at UF. But we were really a pioneer in, particularly in the 80s and 90s, with these materials, methods, and concepts. And I think we were all disappointed to see that it didn't permeate all of development work more, because now there isn't much, not much has been produced. We weren't the only ones working during this period. There were others, but there hasn't been much that much recently. And there aren't as many gender development programs anymore at universities. So this is now, there's a call now for more understanding of gender in relation to infrastructure, for example. So there are new topics that haven't been addressed. And it's not a simple matter, as we learn, to just carry over an idea to another sector. You have to really get inside it and understand. But I will say I started my career as I think I mentioned it before, as a gender specialist. That was a thing. And I had a number of really interesting consulting jobs where I would go somewhere and work on how to incorporate gender. And it was really interesting intellectual exercise. And there's still a big demand for that. So keep that in mind.